Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast as we are going to be breaking down the MLB Playoff Games that began yesterday. It is the Wild Card Series, so of course, if you aren't familiar, which I'm sure you are by now a best of three. So a little bit interesting to see whether or not we have a little bit of history here up to this point in the past two seasons under this new format. I know that 2020, which was a really weird year, did have these rules as well, but nobody really counts 2020 anyways. Respect the Dodgers, but just sort of is how it is. But in these past 2 years, it is interesting that every team that has won Game 1 has won the series, and I believe has swept the series. I could be wrong. Feel free to double check me in the comment section here. But a very interesting situation given that note that two of the higher seeds in the American League went down yesterday. The Astros losing to the Tigers and the Orioles losing to the Royals. So we're going to start off by breaking down the Astros and Tigers game, which was pretty much the exact game that the Tigers needed in order to have a chance in this series. They had to take advantage of Tarik Skubal, who was excellent in this game, 6 scoreless innings. You look at overall the way that he was just able to pound the strike zone throughout, really didn't give the Astros a whole lot to hit on the day as a whole. And, I thought he was pretty clean. There was a little bit of trouble in the 4th inning for him where you have Yordan Alvarez who hits a leadoff single for them. Then he had a couple tough at-bats that he had to face against Alex Bregman and Yanier Diaz, both 9 pitches there. Now, Skubal able to get Bregman to line out. Diaz, on the other hand, draws a walk, so still, a couple runners, first and second, but Skubal sort of got back into his game, back-to-back strikeouts on that changeup that has just been lethal for him, and got out of the jam. His pitch count, yes, was driven up a little bit in this inning, but then he responds with a flawless 5th inning where 5 pitches, 1, 2, 3, get him out of here, and ultimately, he does leave after the 6th. I haven't seen a ton of reporting on it. It sounds like there was a little bit of cramping going on in his lower body. I think it's being speculated that it is his legs, where in that 6th inning at one point, he was working the middle of an at-bat, and then he sort of pulled up and took him a second. The umpire came out. They had a little mound visit there, and ultimately he was able to respond, did allow a single. I believe that one was to Bregman as well, but then got out of the inning. No harm, no foul, and ultimately it was an excellent postseason debut for him, going to be the American League Cy Young winner, possibly the best pitcher in the entire MLB. And again, if the Tigers had any chance to win, it was going to be leaning on Skubal. That being said, the bullpen also did an excellent job for them. You look at what Will Vest has been able to do over the past few weeks out of the bullpen for the Tigers. He comes in, an inning and 2/3, recorded all 5 outs, struck out 4 of them. He's now riding 7 straight scoreless appearances. So he has been, sort of nails out of the bullpen, which is massive for the Tigers. Now, leaned on him for maybe a little bit more extended time. I'll double check his pitch count right now, where he threw 24. So, going to be interesting to see whether or not he does end up taking the mound today. The Tigers are going with a bullpen day, so interesting there. I mentioned that the pitching for Detroit was excellent the entire game. That being said, the 9th inning made things interesting, where they decided to roll out their closer in Jason Foley, who's been their go-to guy this season, and it looked pretty rocky, all things considered. He allowed a leadoff double to Yordan Alvarez. Yanier Diaz ends up driving in a runner, not Alvarez, because he ended up getting pinch run for. He's still dealing with that knee injury. All that being said, though, still pretty great game for him every time the Astros did threaten. Alvarez was at the bottom of it with a couple of leadoff hits there, so wanted to shout him out. But Diaz, also a pretty good game for himself. He ends up with the lone RBI for the Astros in this game. And it didn't stop from there because the Astros ended up getting runners on second and third with just one out. And they ended up pulling Foley, bringing in Beau Brieske to finish the job, which he did. All things considered, did end up loading the bases at one point there, but he's able to get out of it, record his 4th career save in all MLB games, regular season and postseason, and, a great moment for him. That being said, when you look at that final Jason Hayward at bat, he absolutely roped that thing that looked like it was going to be an easy walk-off. Luckily, Spencer Torkelson's there at first base. He makes the play, and the Tigers get out of it alive. It would have been an extremely disheartening loss for the Tigers if they weren't able to pull that one out. But they do, and all things considered, like we just mentioned, with the history of what the recent wild card series have showed us, they have a massive upper hand now, despite the fact that there are still some massive unknowns in terms of what that pitching staff is going to look like moving forward here, where the game is, moments away from starting. Game 2 is. It looks like it is going to be a bullpen game. Tyler Holton starting the game. He did make an appearance yesterday, but very briefly, just for that final out after they pulled vests. So, great win for them then. That being said, the 9th inning does scare me a little bit. The fact that the Astros were able to build up some momentum there, there's definitely a confidence there. There was a clip of, I think it was Altuve and Yordan smiling at each other after that game finished, that it feels like, especially with all the experience they have, they are pretty confident that they're going to be able to respond in this game today. So going to be very interesting to monitor there. It's at least worth mentioning that the postseason struggles from Framber Valdez do continue on here, where I think he's lost his last 4 starts in the postseason, has an ERA over 8. He wasn't good in this game specifically. It was the 2nd inning where he ended up getting pushed around a little bit. That's where all 3 of those runs came from. You saw him missing with location. He sort of continued to back himself up into corners. Now, credit the Tigers for having some great plate appearances then and sort of drawing walks and longer at-bats, but ultimately just not good enough for Valdez, who really hasn't answered any questions as to whether or not he can be a playoff ace for the Astros. Now, that's game 1. Again, you can check that game out after we finish up here. Other game in the American League, Orioles versus Royals, and this was the pitcher's duel we expected. Cole Ragans versus Corbin Burnes. Some of the other candidates behind Tarek Skubal. Skubal ends up winning the Triple Crown in the American League, but Ragans and Burnes were definitely in that conversation all year long. Ragans was excellent in his postseason debut, a 6 scoreless inning outing with 8 strikeouts, just 4 hits allowed, and 0 walks. He was, like I mentioned, he was great there. Corbin Burnes might have actually been better in the loss, and that is what he finishes with. He is responsible for the sole run that was scored as the Orioles do lose 1-0, but Burnes was incredible throughout the game as well. 8 innings pitched, 5 hits, 1 walk, 3 strikeouts, but that run in the 6th is ultimately what did them in. You look at what Kansas City can do both with that starting rotation and the bullpen. They are an incredible pitching staff, and that's what we talked about yesterday when we were previewing this series, is just the fact that I think that the Royals are so much better equipped from a pitching perspective. Now, huge for the Orioles that they were able to get 8 out of Burnes, and that, they didn't have to lean into their bullpen too much, because I do feel like they are weaker from a starting rotation standpoint. But you'll take what you can get out of it. And the Orioles are still a very talented team, of course, but the Orioles didn't do enough offensively. And that is a little bit of a concern because you're talking about last year where they ended up getting swept in the ALDS. This year, off to a bad start where they had opportunities. They were 1 for 7 with runners in scoring position in this game, left 7 runners on base. And, when you look at Kansas City, it was just about getting a single with a guy in running with, getting a single when your guy is in scoring position. And that's just something that the Orioles weren't able to capitalize on throughout this game despite having multiple chances. And it's the team as a whole. I do think that, that was a game that James McCann can't hold your head too much because this is a situation where you're now going into a do or die game today. But McCann, 2 strikeouts with runners in scoring position, both times with 0 outs and with 1 out. You just got to be better than that. And, he knows that. Put the ball in play is obviously, the minimum that you can do. 2 strikeouts there is brutal. But, I still feel like top to bottom, you do look at that offense. There is so much firepower. You feel like they can very easily come alive eventually, in these types of postseason appearances. It's got to have to be today because you are going up against another star pitcher in Seth Lugo where he's probably going to give you 6, maybe more great innings. I mean, Reagan's, he was ready to go more than 6 innings if it weren't for some spasms that he was dealing with as well to sort of take him out of that game. But he specifically mentioned that he's trying to pitch later into October. Totally fair there. And they were able to sort of get the production they needed out of the rest of their bullpen. But, no slouch whatsoever on the mound. Again, either for Seth Lugo. The Royals once again have a I wouldn't even say it was a mismatch. Ultimately, again, I think Burns and Reagan's are, right on the same sort of tier there. This is a game, Lugo versus Eflin, I think is definitely far more in favor of the Rays in this, of the Eflin, former Ray. The Rangers have the upper hand in this series. So ultimately, we'll see. I was picking the Royals coming into this series anyways, and, it's a best of 3. So there's really not much room for error ultimately. The Orioles backed up into a corner. Still haven't necessarily had that postseason success that they have been vying towards these past couple years. We'll see whether or not it starts with their game today. So that game, first pitch, around 4:30 p.m. Eastern. So we'll see about that. But that does sort of take us into now the National League, where also before we move off the AL, just want to say again, the pitching in the American League in yesterday's slates were incredible across the board, where you get some aces and Skubal and Burns and Reagans, and every one of them live up to expectations. I thought that was really special to see. You look at some of the closing performances as well, specifically Urseg for the Royals, being able to sort of maneuver. I mean, the Orioles, they were causing a little bit of, traffic on the base paths towards the end of that game, and Urseg ultimately able to pull them out of it, secure the win. Exactly what a closer should do, and he did. So we are going to now be moving into the National League, where we had the Mets win another resilient performance against the Brewers, and the San Diego Padres staying hot. So we're going to be diving into both of those games, but before we do so, we are going to take a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.